For the fourth and final part of this section on the American presidency, we're going to finish up with what I'm going to call odds and ends. Questions that we'll be talking about here. Is the presidency these days too imperial or too weak? That's an ongoing debate. What about the office of the vice presidency? What's going on with that exactly? What might we say about that? We're going to talk about John Locke's concept of executive prerogative versus legislative supremacy. We'll talk about the role of the president as the head of his or her political party and what the implications of that are politically. We'll talk about executive privilege. And then finally, we'll talk about the two presidencies thesis. So we'll get through this as quickly as we can. I'll make it as painless as I can. Let's get started. Okay, so this is sort of becoming a theme of the semester, right? Has the American presidency grown too powerful relative to Congress in particular? Certainly, right, it's contra the design of the founding fathers who wanted Congress to be preeminent and the presidency somewhat secondary. So that's been the case, right, structurally since the end of World War II, because the rise of a U.S. Superpower military. Who's the commander-in-chief? The president. Who does that make stronger? The president. And, right, the regulatory and welfare state that emerges in the 1930s. It creates a large federal bureaucracy. Who's the chief executive of that large federal bureaucracy? The president, right? And then Trump 2.0 has been extraordinary in terms of these unprecedented assertions of executive power. So I think there's few people today, maybe nobody, who would argue that the American presidency is too weak right now. The only plausible argument, it seems to me, is it's probably a little bit unbalanced these days relative to Congress and the courts. So it's tricky stuff. Are we going to see a reassertive Congress? We haven't seen it yet, not under Trump 2.0. Might we see it after the midterms? I think we will. And might we see a more reassertive Congress after Trump has gone? I suspect we will, but we'll see. All right, so what about the American vice presidency? We know that at the outset, right, the founding fathers made a mistake because they did not anticipate political parties. They said, oh, whoever wins the presidential election becomes president, and whoever gets second place becomes the vice president. Right? And very quickly that became implausible because we had two parties. The first place vote getter would always be of one party, the second place vote getter of a different party, and then you combine them. Makes no sense. So pretty quickly there was a realization that that was a problem. We amended the Constitution, and now the president and the vice president run as a ticket within both parties. They're not given much power under the Constitution, vice presidents. They can preside over the Senate, which sounds like a big deal, but it's really not a big deal. They're not allowed to contribute to debate at all. That's an internal Senate rule. The only thing they can really do in the Senate is break a tie vote. And that can make a difference in some cases. Kamala Harris, I think, has cast the most tie-breaking votes ever because, right, when she was vice president, Biden was president, first 2 years of his presidency, the Democrats had 50 seats in the Senate. Republicans had 50 seats in the Senate. Right, so lots of tie votes. She was able to break those in favor of the president repeatedly. J.D. Vance has done some of that as well on behalf of President Trump. So that's a real power, but it's limited. Historically, it's been understood to be an office with the value of a warm bucket of spit. I think Harry Truman may have said something to that effect. And for most of American history, vice presidents were pretty minor, unless, right, the president died And then, of course, then the vice president becomes the president. That's the vice president's real power. Break glass in case of emergency. And we've had a number, right, who've become president in that way. Also, when you're vice president, right, you can gain profile and run for the presidency later. See Joe Biden, vice president under Obama. So that's certainly a way to get to the Oval Office, is be vice president as a stepping stone. But I would say in the modern era, presidents have been giving vice presidents real power, but that's discretionary to each president. So I think the vice president has become more significant in recent decades. I'm not sure how significant Mike Pence was in Trump 1.0. I think J.D. Vance has been more significant in Trump 2.0. Dick Cheney, by far our most powerful vice president ever. It is said that after 9/11, Dick Cheney essentially took control of U.S. foreign policy and became our de facto president. I don't want to disrespect W. Bush, but I think some of that actually happened. So, no question, Dick Cheney, our most powerful vice president ever. He's an exception, but we have had more significant vice presidents in recent decades for sure. Yeah. What about the concept of executive privilege? Executive privilege is the idea that certain conversations within the White House must be protected from scrutiny by Congress, by the media, by the courts, by any outside parties. The idea being that in order to have these vigorous conversations within the White House regarding politics and policy, the participants in those discussions need to feel free to take a wide range of positions, to take controversial arguments and put them right out there, right? Because that's really the best way to arrive at a good policy, is lay everything out on the table, discuss it all, propose things that might seem a little crazy, see how it goes, a whole lot of back and forth, right? And the idea is, look, if participants in these discussions believe that every single word they say is going to be looked at by others, is going to be reviewed by the media, reviewed by Congress, taken out of context by Congress, utilized against them by the courts, those conversations will be very formal, very limited, very stilted, very ineffective. So the idea is there should be some notion of executive privilege, right? How far does that go? The court has said that indeed executive privilege, although not specifically mentioned in Article 2 of the Constitution, is constitutionally based. For the president to be an effective president, he or she needs to keep certain conversations within the White House confidential. No question about that. Nixon invoked this concept, however, in the case of U.S. v. Nixon, circa 1974. The basic question was that these White House plumbers had been found breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. There was some suspicion that they may have had some connection with the Nixon White House, and so the court in that case that was considering the criminal indictment of these so-called plumbers that had broken into private offices, the court said, "Hey, you know what, Nixon? We would very much like to see or hear the tapes that you've made about conversations within the Oval Office regarding this particular issue. We want the evidence. We think it's important in this trial. It's a criminal trial. Their liberty is at risk. We want that information. We want the tapes." Nixon said not just no, but hell no. He provided some bogus edited versions of the tapes. And ultimately, Nixon said, "Hey, look, I cannot give you everything that you ask for. It's covered under executive privilege. It involves national security. Don't mess with me." And by the way, people, take a look at that link. I've never noticed this before. Look at the argument that James St. Clair makes on behalf of the president, right? He says something like, the president wants me to argue that he has the same powers as King Louis of France, that he has absolute monarchical power. and is not subject to any court. Right? So apparently that's what Nixon told him to argue. So St. Clair makes that argument, right? He represents his client, but he distances himself from that argument, understandably, right? He doesn't say, I believe. He says, the president wants me to argue. I'm like, wow. Talk about selling your client down the river a little bit. And yet, thank heavens he did, right? Because the argument that Nixon wanted him to make was ridiculous, really disturbing. If you're looking for evidence of an imperial presidency, you certainly see it there. So take a close look at that. I would strongly suggest it. The court rightly says, heck, that's bogus. If it was something to do with national security and it needed to be protected, all right, but you're not making that case. And what you seem to be arguing really is that you are a monarch and that what you say goes, and we should take your word for it. Heck no. We think it really involves Nixon security, not national security. So Nixon was forced to surrender the tapes. The tapes revealed conversations about the break-in. Nixon was implicated in at least a cover-up of those break-ins, and that's what ultimately led to his resignation. So the court did say executive privilege, yes, but unlimited executive privilege, no. Executive privilege, if you can defend it in a rational, reasonable way. But executive privilege to protect yourself, no, that's not going to cut it. So we've talked about executive privilege. I want to distinguish that from executive prerogative. Executive prerogative is an idea advanced by John Locke back in the late 1600s. And John Locke, in general, favored legislative supremacy, something roughly akin to what the Founding Fathers desired, which was a Congress that was first among equals. But, Locke said, during times of crises, when the nation is under threat of annihilation, you can have executive prerogative. An executive that can act above the law, beyond the law, even against the law, to save the republic. Once the republic has been saved, return to normalcy, go back to legislative supremacy. So John Locke does carve out the possibility of an exceptionally strong executive, but only under those very particular conditions. Some argue, however, that once the toothpaste is out of the tube, once the executive has that much power, sometimes it's hard to get the toothpaste back into the tube. I've tried. It is damn near impossible. We've talked about this. We've had particular presidents that were really powerful, like Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. But once they were done with their particular crises, the tube took the toothpaste back inside. Some argue, however, since FDR, we have not been able to get the toothpaste back into the tube, that strong executive has become structurally advantaged by shifting world conditions and the creation of a large welfare state. And especially maybe since 9/11, with an ongoing, apparently endless war on terror, right? If we're constantly in a war, we're constantly in crises, the nation is under constant threat of annihilation, we have constant executive prerogative. That's the concern of some, is that the conditions that Locke laid out as exceptional have become normal, and that's created ongoing long-term executive prerogative. That's part of that debate over, do we have an imperial presidency or do we not? Finally, and very briefly, let's talk about what's called the two presidencies thesis. We've made some reference to that before. This is the idea that there are, in a sense, two American presidencies. One of them is the foreign policy presidency, and in that particular area, the president is unquestionably dominant by and large, by dint of their role as commander-in-chief of the military, by their constitutional authority to negotiate treaties with other nations. No question about it, right? But in domestic policy, in things involving things like perhaps questions about healthcare policy or policies involving the environment or policies dealing with labor issues. Here, I think
Congress is much more assertive, much more significant politically, much more likely to combat the president, to compete with the president for supremacy. So I think in domestic policy, Congress and the president are pretty balanced, 50-50. Sometimes the president has the edge, sometimes Congress has the edge, like now perhaps. But in foreign policy, I think it's pretty clear. If in domestic policy it's 50-50, in foreign policy maybe it's more like 80-20. So some will say there's a distinction there. The court, back in 1936, I should mention this, the court in 1936 issued a decision called U.S. v. Curtis Wright, in which they held ultimately that the president in foreign policy has certain inherent powers that accrue to the president by nature of being president, as the sole representative of the nation in foreign affairs. That's worrisome to me, because what does it suggest, and really state, is that in general we have a government of enumerated powers, right? If the president has a power, it must be found in Article 2. If Congress has a power, it must be found in Article 1, or it's unconstitutional. In U.S. v. Curtis Wright, the court goes a further step than that, and they say, look, in foreign policy, the president has certain unenumerated powers that are inherent to the office, that don't require language in Article 2, right? It unmoors the president in foreign policy from Article 2 language. That to me is worrisome. I mean, I get it in a sense, that in some ways the argument has some logic to it. But if you follow it out to its conclusion, it's worrisome, right? Because it does seem to violate the core American principle that we are a government of enumerated powers. And we'll leave it at that. I think we've done a nice job with the presidency. It took us a little while. We'll be moving on next to talk about the federal bureaucracy and then the Nevada executive.